Hello, my name is Imara Jones, and I'm here at the BIONEERS Conference as a special correspondent with FSTV to delve into how that movement, the BIONEERS movement, can help us to heal ourselves, our country, and our planet at a really critical time in history. Because we're here at the BIONEERS Conference, we have to talk to the co-founder, one of the co-founders, Nina Simons, who is also director of the BIONEERS' Every Woman's Leadership Program. So thank you so much for joining us. When you started this in 1990 with Kenny Oswald, did you have a sense of where it was going?
No.
Of course, you haven't aged.
Absolutely not. To be honest, I would have to say that when we began, our work was based more on Kenny's vision. And it was initially his really deep interest in how we could learn from nature, how to live with nature, and how to reinvent human civilization that kind of got us started. And he came to me, the BIONEERS creation story, he might have told you, but it was born in a hot tub.
Tell us. Oh, it's far more interesting. I'm sure that was not a detail that was shared.
Okay.
It's not on anything I've read so far, so do tell.
Well, Kenny and I were both working with a for-profit company called Seeds of Change at the time. And he, as a journalist, was doing a lot of research into biodiversity and the loss of biodiversity, and also the field of bioremediation, which is how you use natural treatment systems to detoxify water and soil and air. And at one point, he was in a hot tub with a friend, and he was telling his friend about all the amazing innovators that he was learning about, and just super excited, and explaining that these people were amazing, but that the tragedy was that no one knew about them. And his friend said, well, why don't you have a conference? And Kenny said, well, I've never been to a conference. It sounds boring. Why would I do that? And the friend said, here's a grant for $10,000, have a conference. So Kenny came to me because I had a background in theater. And he said, will you help me produce a conference? And I also had never been to a conference. But, you know, I was curious and I could sense that it was important. And so I agreed to help him. And I remember sitting there at our first conference with my mouth hanging open. Imara, I mean, I just was so spellbound by the kind of ingenuity that the people had, and their inventiveness and their joy and their creativity. And there was also, even back in 1990, there were indigenous voices at the first conference. And I think we were blessed because we had never made a conference, so we invented it fresh. We didn't have to unlearn anything.
Right.
So I kind of got hooked at my first conference. And it took me time to grow into and really infuse BIONEERS with my own vision. So it was really over the first 10 years that I felt like I grew into my own part of it fully.
One of the key things I think about BIONEERS is that it has a very simple idea, which is to let the intelligence of nature guide us in terms of how we should live, right, and how we should organize ourselves. It's pretty simple, it's pretty basic. But like nature, sometimes that has things that are beautiful and sometimes things that are really difficult. And one of the things that you and Kenny are very explicit about are the ways in which BIONEERS in some ways was created out of trauma, out of a crisis point in Kenny's life and for the both of you. Can you talk a little bit about that and how it kind of set you on the path to where you are?
Well, sure. I think that Kenny and I have always both been motivated by a core impulse toward healing. You know, the first work that we ever did together was on a film that was about the politics of medicine and cancer therapies. And so it was sort of this meeting of the healing capacity of the natural world with the injustice of unjust political systems. So from the very beginning, when we first started working together, that nexus was a place that drew us both. You know, even back in 1990 or 1989, we both could see that human civilization and nature were on a collision course, right? James Hansen had already sort of sounded the alarm about climate change. And we knew from our work with Seeds of Change that biodiversity in the food system was under serious threat. And we also knew that the chemical industries and the pharmaceutical industries, which were largely unregulated and still are, were in danger of really polluting our air and soil and water. And of course, in the last 28 years, all of those threats have enormously expanded and accelerated. So it was an attempt to, I think, you know, in many ways we both realized that the mainstream media were only covering the bad news and not the good news. And that part of our impulse was to say, well, we need to lift up a vision so that people can be inspired to engage in their own way. And so that we can help catalyze the citizen engagement and movements that need to happen in order to shift our collective course. So I think it was a combination of wanting to share the goodies, you know, and really wanting to be able to spread the inspiration around as a means of catalyzing change.
So as a person who is used to thinking about this intersection and this interplay between the crisis moments in history, recent history, and the hope in that, and the hope that drove you all to figure out a way to take people who, as everyone says, BIONEERS is about taking the smartest people that you've never heard and putting them on stage, the best ideas you've never heard and putting them on stage. What do you have to say about the moment that we're in right now, where for so many people, darkness seems to be compiled upon darkness every single day?
Well, I mean, there's no doubt that we are facing serial crises at a level that I've never experienced in my life before, and I don't know if we as a species have ever experienced to this extent before. And, you know, when I was growing up, my father used to say to me, people don't change until it's really uncomfortable, you know, and I feel like I'm learning the reality of that as I live it. So, you know, really, as soon as our last election happened, the thing that I knew in my bones was that there was a silver lining, which was that, you know, it may well be that this level of extremism and polarization and hatred is the only thing that would have woken people up to the extent that people all over the world are uprising.
One of the things that I think is interesting is that it seems as if one of the things that's driving this crisis moment, and one of the things that it's accompanied by, is rank misogyny. Rank misogyny across the board, from a range of political leaders, business leaders, entertainment leaders, you name it.
Yep.
Even in the way that BIONEERS came about was through you, right? Through the organization and the involvement of women, because Kenny said, I have a great idea, so you gotta help me do it. Because I can't do it. And so I'm wondering what you have to say. What are your thoughts about the necessity for women and women's leadership as this moment, women's leadership as an antidote to help blunt the darkness that we were talking about and to usher in a new age?
Well, I actually think it's one of the two most important things we could be focused on right now as a species. And there are researchers that have identified that gender bias is the deepest bias in the human psyche around the world, bar none. So, more so than race or faith or anything else, gender bias is really deeply embedded in humanity. And, you know, there isn't hardly a woman on the planet who is surprised by the level of misogyny that's going on. The people who are surprised are the men. And you know, I'm interested in the phenomena of how, or the phenomenon of how prejudice confers, privilege is what I want to say, of how privilege confers blinders. You know, that if you're in the benefiting side of the equation, it just becomes normalized and you don't see that anything imbalanced is going on. So a lot of the research around the world has proven at this point that as you increase the education and the involvement in the leadership of women, everything gets better. Whether it's water management or ecological resources or health or peace or economics. So, the data's in. But one of the things I've learned through BIONEERS is that story often beats data, you know? And that story about the gender bias is so deeply emotionally entwined with how we understand our identities.
That's right.
It's going to take big, deep work to shift it. And so my personal mission is not only about strengthening and connecting and unleashing the full capacity of women in leadership in every direction, but also about reclaiming and revaluing those human qualities that have been associated with the feminine, that have been undervalued and undermined in all of us. So regardless of what gender anyone happens to be in, right? We all need to feel more. We all need to get better at our relational intelligence. We need to exercise our intuition and value whatever we understand as our spiritual connection to the greater good and the whole. And we need to strengthen our connection to embodied wisdom. So I think it's both. For me, I've always imagined my own calling as being both about strengthening and connecting women and about restoring the feminine to a place of equilibrium within us all and within our institutions and our governance and everything else.
Right, and as a place of honor, right, and as a place of reverence, because in so many indigenous native cultures in the United States, in Africa, and around the world, the sacred feminine has power. It has reverence.
And it's where we all came from.
It's our first home. I always say that your
right.
mom is your first home.
That's right.
It's the first place you ever lived.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that's interesting, one of the things I always say is that men basically are taught through education that there are only two acceptable emotions, right? One is anger and the other one is sex, emotions that are sexualized. And so if you think about that,
very limited palette.
It's a very limited palette. And so then if that's the case, as that's the case, then your society will reach crisis.
Absolutely. Well, and I even want to push back on that and say,
push back.
I believe that the anger that men are trained is an option for them is a very twisted form of that emotion. And that in its purest sense, there's a brilliant author named Carla McLaren, and she says that anger is our body's way of telling us that a boundary has been trespassed. So that's different than aggression or rage or what you're mentioning.
That's right.
I mean, and the idea that sexuality is seen as an emotion. It's like, that's interesting. I guess lust maybe, but I don't think of that as an emotion. Actually, I think of it as a body thing more.
It's a behavior. It's a behavior that's connected to an emotional reaction. Right. That you can't express.
That's right. That you can't express emotionally, so you can only express it physically.
Exactly.
Yes. No, we have a lot of unlearning to do about how we raise boys and men and women. There's so much acculturated learning that's been damaging us for so long. And I feel like for myself, I keep peeling back layers of the onion skin to get to what's more truthfully, authentically who I am. And to learn how to walk, as some sort of a role model, at least for myself, of who I want to be.
Right. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things in all of this is not only having women in leadership roles, but one of the things that we're increasingly learning is to have women be heard, right, in those roles. Yeah. Right. So it's one thing to sit in the chair and to be heard. And I'm wondering, in terms of the transformation of men, how do you think it's possible to get men to hear women, and how have you been able to make yourself heard?
For the last 12 years, we have been offering a 6-day immersion training called Cultivating Women's Leadership. And part of what we do in that training is to help women clarify their own sense of calling or purpose. because our sense is that the more that each one of us connects to that, the more unstoppable we become. And then to give women an experience, because we're all trained to see each other as competition and as potential foes. And in fact, I think one of the greatest untapped resources in the world is women's capacity, when we're in authentic alliance, to exponentially strengthen each other's leadership and boldness and clarity. And so that's part of what we've been doing there. I think, you know, for me, part of the power of what BIONEERS does is to hold up role models for everybody. And it's part of how I've grown myself, is by witnessing examples of women whose leadership I admired so much that I wanted to be like them. That somehow, without even having to know them personally, they could inform how I was growing myself. And I think that that's really exciting to me in a world where there aren't enough role models for people of all colors, of all genders, of all disciplines, you know, and of all ages. And to be able to lift up role models so that young people and people of every age who are reinventing themselves can actually see their possibilities opened up by, oh, I could be like that one. Oh, I could become a weave of these 3 parts of myself that I love, but I never knew how I could make a living at them. But here's a person doing it. I could do that, you know? I love that. So, I mean, the question of how to sort of break through to men is hard. and you know, I've been reflecting that even though for years, Imara, I have said to myself, it's not going to be pretty, the thrashing of the dying dinosaur of patriarchy's tail. Yeah. You know, I've sort of imagined that coming, but I've never been able to understand in my body like I do now how ugly it actually is, and how much damage can actually be done by it. So I think partly it's going to be a generational die-off. I think partly it's going to be just the voice of the people, with women in the lead, demanding change. And you know, I have to believe that this serial cases of misogyny that are getting so much publicity right now are going to put a big chill on harassment in the workplace. And, you know, I also imagine there are some really amazing male teachers out there who are doing a lot of work with young people and with men in the prisons, and really teaching people how to get out of the box of toxic masculinity, because what a damaging and painful way to live that must be.
That's right. There's a saying that a dying mule kicks the hardest. So,
there you go.
It's another way to phrase what you were saying. I mean, one of the other challenges in this is, as you said, deconstructing the gender binary, because it's actually the first concept of organization of society that you learned, is the difference between boys and girls. It's the first thing that you learn about how this society is organized. Yep. And so then after a while, it becomes an article of faith, right? Which is one of the reasons why, as you say, it continues regardless of what happens or what changes, because it is an article of faith that this division is real, the assignments are real and immutable.
Well, but as we both know, pretty much everyone under 30 has been disabused of that notion, right? So, and really what I've been teaching and hoping for and pointing towards is something I call full spectrum leadership, which is that no matter what gender you happen to be in, I want to access the full range of my human capacities at any given moment, depending on what's needed. And I don't want to be limited by somebody's definition of what's feminine and what's masculine. That's crap, you know? We're all human, and it's not serving us to, you know, it's so clear that it's time to transcend the binaries, not only in gender, but in race as well, you know, obviously. Yeah.
I mean, one of the challenges to the under 30 is what happened in Charlottesville, right? Where there was all these young men who were
Yeah.
Perpetuating a vision of society that's, as we say, antisocial, to say the least.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that I think that one of the things we're going to see over the next 3 days is a counterpoint to that, right? That here
very
is
much
a
so.
different vision for how society can work.
I think, one of the things that inspires me the most right now is the leadership of the young people who come to BIONEERS. And they are fierce, they are so committed, and oftentimes young people will come and they'll come up to me and they'll say, when I came, I had no idea what I could possibly aspire to becoming that would make any sense to me. Wow. That would both fulfill my desire for creativity and expression and make a contribution to the world. And now I feel like I have 10 options to research, and that's great. So I think that at the same time as there is tremendous depression and suicide and disillusionment among many youth in our world, there are also a lot of young people who've been raised by very conscious parents and who are absolutely, unstoppable in their commitment to transform how we're living and to slow and stop climate chaos and to reinvent democracy in a way that actually is just and healthy and real.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What is your biggest hope, or in what area has your hope grown? What are you now more hopeful about since 1990 and in this moment?
Since 1990, that's way too big an arc. I would say two things. I think really the leadership of women and the leadership of First Peoples. I have been so inspired. Standing Rock was an amazing event, and I think that they collaboratively modeled a way to stand on behalf of life that was nonviolent and prayerful and artful, and that was incredible and inclusive, which, given the history of their people, that they could have that level of generosity and welcoming is pretty breathtaking. So I'm deeply inspired by knowing that the way forward has to integrate traditional wisdom, and that there are many indigenous peoples on this planet who have done their own work enough to be able to welcome us and share with us some of what they know before it's too late and before it's all gone. So I'm incredibly hopeful about indigenous peoples and the ways that they are connecting across tribal identities and the ways that they are reinventing what protest and defiance and protection look like. And honestly, I think that women's capacity to take the long view, to resource ourselves, to both strategize and be in authentic and deepening relationship with each other and the earth is one of the greatest powers and capacities that we have. And it was a surprise to me that working with women led me into racial justice work, because when I realized how much crap I had inside me as a privileged white woman, and then realized how much more my sisters who were women of color were carrying, I was like, oh, this is so not okay. And it really called me into a different level of commitment and courage and a deepened systemic understanding of, how the whole system of ranking and hierarchy has to change. I think we're in a paradigm shift. And I think women, indigenous people, and youth are our best shot with great, big-hearted, conscious, wise men as allies, because we need everybody.
Because one of the things, I mean, we're obsessed with hierarchy and ranking and segmentation, but the key thing that we understand about nature is the fact that it's an interlocking system.
That's right.
You know, that the smallest things are interacting with the biggest things and vice versa. It's all interacting together. And on some level, as a biology teacher told me once, dominance doesn't dominate in nature.
I've just been writing my talk for Sunday morning, and it's all about how diversity is key to our resilience. You know, and it's the interconnection at the edges in nature. The places with the greatest innovation and fertility are the places where two or more ecosystems meet, you know?
Right.
So that's got to be true of our human systems too.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And so the desire to create monocultures in our society is actually damaging, right?
Oh,
It's
more than
damaging to
damaging.
us.
It's a death spiral. Yep.
Right the way across the board.
Yeah.
When people leave in 3 days' time at the conference, what do you hope that they'll go back into the world with?
Well, for one thing, I hope that they'll go back feeling restored and renewed. And, you know, so many people have come to me over the years and said, this is my source for renewal. You know, thank you for being here. It's like a fountain.
Right.
And I think so many people who are working as activists and fighting the good fight get exhausted. I think it's part of the imbalance of our culture is we don't know how to replenish ourselves adequately, and we tend to be not so great at self-care. So I hope people feel strengthened. And I hope people leave with a fistful of new ideas and connections and relationships they want to follow up on. And perhaps even with an opened up sense of how they might interface with this movement of movements. That instead of just being a single issue person, they have a deepened understanding of the interconnectedness of all the issues we face.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and it's also the case that one of the things that nature has to tell us about is restoration, right?
Yeah.
How it naturally knows how to, at the end of a life cycle, create something new. And so that's one of the roles that BIONEERS is playing in terms of people feeling that they're at the end and needing to come to a place that restores them.
It's helpful to me to remember these days that, I mean, we're in a period of death and rebirth, right? There was an amazing midwife who was at the conference a few years back, and she raised her hand at the end of a session and she said, you know, there comes a time in every birth when the woman feels that she can't go on any further, when the pain is so bad and the blood is so heavy and the contractions are so sharp and she feels like she just can't make it another minute. And that's how we know the baby is about to be born. And I think we're in one of those moments, you know? And so part of what we're here for is to birth the vision of the new world, because without the vision, we can't get there. So, you know, there's a great indigenous activist named Reuben Snake who said, if we're not careful, we're going to end up right where we're heading. And, you know, so in many ways, I think this is a choral effort to lift up a vision that's a collaborative vision, because no one person has all the answers anymore. That's a kaleidoscopic vision so that everyone can see themselves reflected in it. That's a pluralistic vision that says we can be unified but also retain our individuality and our uniqueness. And that invites everyone into the game.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, Nina, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. And thank you for your leadership and for your lifting up. And I'm thrilled to be able to, through this conversation and FSTV, to be connected with you now.
Thank you.
Out of BIONEERS. It's really an honor, and I appreciate it so much.
Well,
and I'm
back
sure
at
audience
you.
does. Thank you.
It's great to meet you, Imara.
Same here.
Thank you for all your good work.
Thank you.
All right.
And so please be sure to connect with BIONEERS online. It is a conference, but it's also an organization that has reach across the country, across a number of communities. As Nina said, we all need to find a way to bond together and to lift each other up in this moment of crisis. So thank you for joining us.